act as antioxidants?
Yeah, so in fact, there's really only one probiotic strain that can act as antioxidants, and it comes from the Bacillus family as well. So these Bacillus endospore strains have been shown to actually produce antioxidants within the gut itself. Now, they produce a number of really useful things. They produce things like methylated B vitamins. They produce ubiquinols, quinones, vitamin K, K2 specifically. And so part of what they produce are certain types of antioxidants like beta carotene, alpha carotene, lycopene. So it's very interesting that these particular strains have that capability of taking incoming food and actually converting them into antioxidants and other useful nutrients as well, including really critical vitamins like methylated B vitamins.
Kiran, can you tell us what you're finding out about autism and the gut?
Yeah, so autism is becoming more and more clear that there's a really in primarily all ASD kids. So a study published in, I think it was 2013, had shown that up to 98% of kids on the spectrum had digestive issues as well. And we're starting to see more and more characteristics of kids who are on the spectrum with a particular type of gut flora. There are certain organisms that are very closely correlated to the onset and progression of symptoms like Clostridium tetani or Histolyticum. These are species that have been shown to be associated with kids who have ASD symptoms. Now, there's been a number of researchers that have been typing the gut microbes of kids with ASD and kids without, and they are finding these very, very clear distinctions between the two. So it's becoming more and more clear that there's a very important gut component to ASD. And when there is a gut component to ASD, if that becomes the main factor that triggers the condition in certain kids and not in others, then it becomes extremely hopeful that we can change the gut flora in those kids and potentially reverse the condition. So this has actually been studied, and in fact, a publication, a review publication in 2015 showed that probiotics, one that can get in there, survive, and actually fight off some of these unfavorable organisms, could be really beneficial to kids on the spectrum with ASD type of symptoms, because once we can fix the gut flora, it tends to help with a lot of the other symptoms. Welcome.
Okay, my next question is, Kiran, what are some exciting projects you're involved with as a microbiologist?
So the most exciting one is we're working on figuring out how we can actually stop something called metabolic endotoxemia. Most people have never heard of this. Most doctors have never heard of it, and most doctors have never used it as a diagnosis. But I would say, at a conservative estimate, that about 80% of people that visit a doctor's office with some ailment or the other, the underlying diagnosis should be metabolic endotoxemia. Now, it sounds like a fancy term, but basically what it means is leaky gut that comes after eating a meal, right? So let me explain what that looks like and what that actually means. So many people have heard of the term leaky gut. Now, it's not a great description of what's actually happening, because the lining of the intestines is supposed to be somewhat leaky, because that's where you absorb all your nutrients and things like that. So it's supposed to be leaky to nutrients and vitamins and, of course, caloric compounds. That's how your body gets its energy and its nutrients. However, one effect is the leaking in of bacterial components, primarily something called endotoxins. So most of the bacteria that live in your gut, the good commensal bacteria, are called gram-negative bacteria. These bacteria have a little toxin in their outer cell membrane that's perfectly fine. It doesn't cause any harm at all as long as it's in the cell membrane. When these bacteria die, they release the cell membrane, and this particular toxin gets released and exposed into the digestive system. Now, if you're somebody that has metabolic endotoxemia, which it seems like a majority of the adult population does, every time you eat food, You get a die off of these bacteria. They release the endotoxins. You don't have a well enough constructed protective barrier in your intestines, and these toxins end up leaking into your system. And when the toxins end up leaking into your system, you can actually measure them. 3 to 5 hours after a meal, you can measure the increase in this. So in our study with the University of North Texas, what we were able to show is that if we give someone a challenge meal, in this case, what we're trying to do is induce this at a higher level. So we give them a high-fat, high-caloric meal, which typically is a fast food meal, so it's got bad fats in it as well. What we're seeing is that after the meal, we get a 500 to 600% increase in this toxin in the blood. Previous to the meal, the toxin wasn't really there in the blood, or it was there at very low levels. Now, after the meal, we get a 500 or 600% increase. Now, looking at that single increase from a single meal, it takes the body about 2 weeks to recover from that one increase. So imagine that this is happening 2-3 times a day, every single day. Your body never really recovers from this huge endotoxic rise. So basically, it's like a little bit of poison entering your body every time you eat food. Now, what's substantial about this is that there's been a significant number of studies over the last 3 to 5 years that have shown that this increase in toxicity in your blood after a meal is the #1 driving force behind virtually every prevalent chronic illness that is suffered by the Western population. Starting with cardiovascular disease, it's the #1 driving cause of cardiovascular disease, of diabetes, of obesity, of virtually every autoimmune disease, whether it's Crohn's, IBD, colitis, or simple allergies or Hashimoto's. It's even a factor in things like anxiety, depression, in aches and pains in the body. It's even things in like brain fog and memory recall issues, anorexia, Parkinson's. All of these things are now connected to this chronically elevated amount of toxicity in our system that comes from just eating food. And we know that we can't stop eating food. And it happens with healthy food as well as bad food. It's a little bit worse with bad food. So there's a benefit to eating healthy food, but still, it still happens. And the reason is because we don't have a healthy enough microbiome to protect us from the toxicity associated with just the act of digestion. So what we've been looking at is how do we stop this reaction? How do we stop this continuous flow of inflammation into the body from the digestive system? This flow is the #1 cause of mortality worldwide because it's the #1 driver of most chronic illnesses. And if we can stop that flow, we can potentially change the lives of millions of people. And what we've been able to do is publish a study that's actually going to be published in the World Journal of Gastrointestinal Pathophysiology, that these endospore-like bacteria that I've talked about previously actually have the capability of sealing up the gut lining and creating a protective enough barrier with the mucus layer that it doesn't allow for this endotoxic rise after a meal. You know, we did a simple study with college students, and we took 100 healthy, normal weight, young college students. We tested them for this endotoxic response. We found that 55% of them had this toxic response every time they ate a meal. And what we were able to do is take those 55%, put them on a 30-day probiotic therapy with no other changes, and that toxicity went away after 30 days. So we completely sealed up the gut. So this is a real profound and exciting area of science, because if we can shut off this inflammation valve that's going on, we could potentially mitigate the cause of so many illnesses and the illnesses that are actually targeting the vast majority of our population.
That's fascinating, Kiran. Is this endotoxin response leaky gut?
Yeah. It's actually a more descriptive and specific way of describing leaky gut. So what alternative medicine practitioners have been talking about for virtually decades, this concept of leaky gut, is now being better understood as metabolic endotoxemia, and is now being widely accepted. Even the NIH is studying metabolic endotoxemia. We're, in fact, in the throes of putting together a project with the NIH, National Institutes of Health, the biggest research organization in the world, really, next to the World Health Organization, because they're studying it in specific diseases like HIV. You know, we know that in the case of HIV, for example, the virus attacks a lot of the intestinal tissue and causes a lot of inflammation in there, which causes massive amounts of this metabolic endotoxemia and leaky gut. And studies have shown that this amount of leaky gut, of leakiness of the gut, is a better predictor of mortality in HIV patients than viral load itself. So that's really what's driving all of the co-infections that HIV subjects get. Now, in non-HIV subjects, in people that are suffering from, obesity or type 2 diabetes or heart disease or cancers, it's the same exact mechanism. It's not as severe as it is in HIV, but it's the same exact mechanism. So it's the underlying cause in most of these chronic conditions.
Karen, I'm just going to pause for a second.
Okay.
Volume. One last